Some disappearances make sense. A wrong turn. A sudden storm. A deadly encounter with wildlife. But every so often, a case emerges that leaves behind evidence so strange, so unsettling, that even experienced investigators struggle to explain it. This is one of those stories. Actually, it's three. 3 experienced outdoorsmen. 3 remote wilderness locations. 3 investigations that ended with more questions than answers. One man vanished despite carrying a loaded handgun he never fired. Another disappeared in broad daylight while exploring terrain he knew how to navigate. And years later, 2 sets of human remains would be discovered in the same forest within days of each other, reopening mysteries many believed would never be solved. What investigators found at these scenes wasn't just unusual. It was deeply disturbing. Because in each case, the wilderness seemed willing to reveal only part of the truth. And the missing pieces may be the most important of all. Our first case begins in the frozen wilderness of northern Minnesota. A place where the forests stretch for miles without interruption. A place where lakes, rivers, and endless trees create one of the most isolated landscapes in America. And where a man named Jordan Grider walked into the wilderness and never returned. To understand why Jordan's disappearance is so troubling, you first need to understand who he was. Jordan Grider was 29 years old, but unlike most people who occasionally camped or hiked, the outdoors wasn't a hobby for him. It was his life. For more than a decade, Jordan had chosen to live almost entirely in the wilderness. He wasn't someone testing survival skills on weekends. He had spent years sleeping beneath the stars, navigating remote forests, and adapting to conditions that most people would find unbearable. Friends and family knew him as someone who felt more comfortable among trees than inside buildings. When people referred to him as homeless, Jordan quickly corrected them. In his mind, he wasn't homeless at all. The wilderness was simply where he belonged. After spending time visiting family in New Mexico during the fall of 2018, Jordan began preparing for another extended stay in the outdoors. Nothing seemed unusual. He shared meals with relatives. Spent time with his father and brothers. Talked about future plans. Then eventually said goodbye. He told his family he had found an incredible place to camp and planned to stay there for months. Nobody was concerned. Jordan had done this countless times before. If anyone could survive alone in remote wilderness, it was him. Weeks later, Jordan traveled north toward Minnesota's Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. The region covers more than 1 million acres of forests, lakes, and rugged terrain. It is beautiful. It is remote. And in some places, help can be days away. Jordan parked his truck near the Sioux Hustler Trail and headed deeper into the forest. Roughly 1.5 miles from the trailhead, he established a campsite. The location appeared carefully chosen. Exactly the kind of spot an experienced outdoorsman would select. Over the following days, Jordan remained in contact with family members. He sent updates. Shared photographs. Everything appeared normal. One image showed a peaceful beaver pond surrounded by quiet wilderness. To his family, it was simply another glimpse into the life Jordan loved. Nothing about it hinted at what was coming. Around the same period, Jordan made a trip into a nearby town to purchase supplies. Later, investigators would recover a receipt confirming the visit. It looked routine. The actions of a man preparing for a long winter in the woods. Then the messages stopped. One day passed. Then another. A week became 2. 2 weeks became a month. The silence grew impossible to ignore. Family members became increasingly worried. This wasn't like Jordan. He was independent, but he rarely disappeared completely. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, a Forest Service employee noticed something unusual. Jordan's pickup truck was parked in an area where it shouldn't have been. The vehicle was blocking access to a gated road leading toward private property. No driver. No note. No sign of the owner. Assuming it had simply been abandoned, officials arranged for the truck to be moved. At the time, nobody suspected they were looking at the first clue in a much larger mystery. As concern continued to grow, search efforts began. Investigators had very little to work with. One of the only leads was the photograph Jordan had previously sent from the wilderness. Using the image as a reference point, searchers entered the forest hoping to locate his camp. But the wilderness gave them nothing. No campsite. No equipment. No trace of Jordan. It was as though he had vanished into the landscape itself. Months passed. Winter tightened its grip across northern Minnesota. Snow buried the forest beneath layers of ice and silence. Then, in April of 2019, nearly 6 months after Jordan was last heard from, search teams finally located his campsite. What they discovered there changed everything. At first glance, the camp looked exactly as expected. A tarp stretched between trees. A hammock positioned underneath for shelter. The setup was organized and deliberate. This wasn't the camp of someone in distress. It belonged to someone who knew precisely what he was doing. Then investigators looked closer. And everything stopped making sense. There was blood. A shocking amount of it. Blood stained the hammock. Blood covered the sleeping bag. Blood marked the interior of the shelter. Even the ground beneath showed signs of significant blood loss. The scene suggested a catastrophic injury. Yet there was one thing missing. Jordan himself. No body. No explanation. No indication of where he had gone. But investigators found something else. Something that made the situation even more disturbing. Jordan's handgun. The weapon was still there. Still loaded. Still ready to fire. Not a single round had been discharged. Think about that for a moment. This was not an inexperienced camper caught off guard by the wilderness. This was a man with over 10 years of survival experience. A man who understood danger. A man carrying a firearm for protection. Yet whatever happened at that campsite occurred so quickly, or so unexpectedly, that he never fired a single shot. And that raised a terrifying question. What could overwhelm someone like Jordan Grider before he even had time to react? The answer would only become more unsettling as investigators continued searching the forest. When investigators first located Jordan Grider's campsite, winter still had a firm grip on the boundary waters. Thick snow covered much of the surrounding terrain, making a full search nearly impossible. The team documented the scene, secured what evidence they could, and made the difficult decision to return once the snow had melted. Weeks later, dozens of searchers came back. Grid teams spread across the forest. Cadaver dogs swept through the trees. Every section of wilderness surrounding the campsite was carefully examined. This time, the forest finally revealed something. But it wasn't the answer anyone had hoped for. Scattered among the trees were human bones. Not an entire skeleton. Not a complete body. Just individual remains lying apart from one another. Investigators recovered vertebrae, ribs, sections of a leg bone, pieces of an arm, and several smaller bone fragments scattered throughout the area. Additional remains would be discovered during later searches. Jordan's phone was eventually recovered. Pieces of torn clothing were found nearby. His jacket had been ripped apart. His personal belongings were spread across the forest floor. But one critical piece was never found. His skull had vanished. Search teams returned repeatedly, expanding the search area again and again. Despite their efforts, the skull was never recovered. It was simply gone. In August of 2020, DNA testing officially confirmed the remains belonged to Jordan Grider. His family finally received confirmation of what they had feared for nearly 2 years. But confirmation wasn't the same as answers. The official investigation could identify who the remains belonged to. It could not explain how he died. His cause of death was listed as unknown. No evidence of homicide. No clear indication of an accident. No definitive explanation. Officially, the case was considered closed. For Jordan's family, it was anything but. His mother struggled to believe the mystery would never be solved. She wondered whether wolves could have attacked him while he slept. It seemed like one possible explanation. But wildlife experts quickly pointed out a serious problem. Confirmed fatal wolf attacks on humans in North America are extraordinarily rare. Even more importantly, an attack by multiple wolves would almost certainly leave unmistakable evidence. A violent struggle. Destroyed camping equipment. Heavy damage to the shelter. Defensive injuries. Yet investigators found almost none of those signs. The hammock remained largely intact. The campsite showed surprisingly little disturbance. Only blood. Silence. And unanswered questions. Another possibility was raised by Jordan's family. He often shaved using a traditional straight razor. Could he have accidentally cut a major artery? Could he have bled to death alone before help ever arrived? Again, investigators found little evidence supporting the idea. The campsite contained no exposed razor blade. Every knife recovered had been safely sheathed. Once again, the theory fell apart. Years later, people reviewing Jordan's online activity made another disturbing discovery. In the days before he disappeared, Jordan had uploaded 2 videos from the wilderness. At first, they seemed ordinary. Then viewers noticed something hidden in the background. A strange sound echoed through the darkness. Low. Deep. Unlike anything listeners could confidently identify. Jordan pointed his camera toward the trees as though trying to capture whatever was making the noise. Nothing appeared on screen. Only darkness. And that unsettling sound. In another recording, Jordan sat quietly inside his shelter, listening. The same mysterious noise returned. This time, he spoke about something he hadn't mentioned to his family. He claimed there were enormous handprints on his truck. Handprints he insisted weren't his. Whether those prints had a simple explanation or not has never been confirmed. But when combined with everything else, they only added another layer of uncertainty to an already baffling case. Consider the facts. Jordan had survived alone in remote wilderness for over 10 years. He was healthy. Experienced. Prepared. He carried a loaded handgun. Yet he never fired it. His remains were eventually found scattered across the forest. His skull was never recovered. And investigators could not determine how he died. For many people, those unanswered questions remain the most unsettling part of the story. But Jordan's case was not the only mystery hidden inside America's wilderness. More than 1,500 miles away, another forest was quietly keeping its own secrets. Deep within Washington state lies the Gifford Pinchot National Forest. Nearly 1 million acres of towering evergreens, volcanic rock formations, hidden caves, and rugged backcountry. It's breathtakingly beautiful. It's also one of the most unforgiving landscapes in the Pacific Northwest. In September 2013, 2 experienced cave explorers entered this wilderness searching for ancient lava tube formations. Their names were Christopher Zitzewitz and Caleb. Neither man was inexperienced. Both had spent years exploring underground cave systems and navigating hazardous terrain. This wasn't a reckless adventure. It was something they had trained for. As they explored the lava fields, the 2 friends eventually separated to examine different sections of the landscape. It seemed like a reasonable decision. Experienced explorers often divide areas to cover more ground. But only one of them came back. When Caleb attempted to reunite with Christopher, he was nowhere to be found. He called his name. Again. And again. Nothing answered except the forest itself. Caleb searched alone for hours before finally accepting the possibility that something had gone terribly wrong. With no other option, he hiked back out and contacted authorities. A massive search operation quickly began. Detectives compared the challenge to searching for a needle hidden inside an endless maze of volcanic rock. The terrain was brutally difficult. Sharp lava fields. Hidden crevices. Underground tubes disappearing into darkness. Loose rock that erased footprints almost instantly. Search teams combed the wilderness day after day. They explored accessible caves. Checked surrounding forests. Followed every lead they could develop. Nothing. No equipment. No clothing. No signs of injury. No trace of Christopher anywhere. Eventually, the search was suspended. Another experienced outdoorsman had seemingly disappeared without leaving behind a single explanation. And unbelievably, that forest wasn't finished yet. Years passed. Christopher Zitzewitz' disappearance slowly faded from the headlines, but for the people who loved him, time brought no peace. There was no body. No explanation. Only silence. Then the Gifford Pinchot National Forest claimed another experienced outdoorsman. His name was John Hopkins. At 69 years old, John had spent decades hiking some of the most challenging wilderness in the Pacific Northwest. Friends described him as careful, knowledgeable, and completely comfortable in remote terrain. When he drove to the trailhead near McClellan Meadows in 2018, nobody imagined it would be his final trip. Days later, concerned family members contacted authorities after they were unable to reach him. Investigators located his vehicle exactly where he had parked it. But something immediately stood out. Most of his hiking equipment was still inside. Essential gear that an experienced outdoorsman would normally never leave behind. It appeared that John had entered the forest carrying very little. Why he did so remains unknown. Search teams moved through the surrounding wilderness, checking trails, ridgelines, and dense sections of forest. Nothing. No footprints. No clothing. No campsite. No clues. As winter arrived and heavy snow covered the mountains, the search was suspended. Like Christopher before him, John Hopkins had simply disappeared. For years, both cases remained unsolved. Then, nearly a decade after Christopher vanished, the forest finally began giving up its secrets. In 2023, two hunters traveling through a remote section of Gifford Pinchot National Forest stumbled upon personal belongings later identified as John's. Curiously, the items were found about 1.5 miles from where investigators had originally focused their search. Even more puzzling, that area had already been examined years earlier. How had those belongings gone unnoticed? Had they always been there? Or had they somehow arrived later? No one could answer. Determined to finally bring closure to John's family, authorities launched another large-scale search in 2024. This time, they found human remains. DNA testing confirmed the remains belonged to John Hopkins. After years of uncertainty, his family finally knew where he had been. But the discovery solved only one mystery. The cause of his death remained undetermined. Investigators still couldn't explain what had happened. Then, only days after John's remains were recovered, something extraordinary happened. A hiker exploring the same general area noticed a human skull resting on the forest floor. He immediately contacted law enforcement. Deputies collected the skull and conducted a brief search but found nothing else nearby. The hiker couldn't shake the feeling that something had been overlooked. He returned with investigators the following day. This time, they searched more thoroughly. Additional human remains were discovered. DNA analysis produced an astonishing result. The remains belonged to Christopher Zitzewitz, the experienced cave explorer who had vanished 11 years earlier. Two missing men. Separated by years. Different circumstances. Yet their remains were discovered within days of each other in the same remote wilderness. Coincidence? Perhaps. But investigators were left with another unsettling pattern. Neither set of remains showed the clear bite marks typically associated with animal scavenging. Medical examiners found no obvious evidence that predators had caused the unusual distribution of the bones. Jordan Grider's case revealed similar questions. His remains had also been scattered. His femur showed signs of being broken by tremendous force rather than the kind of fractures normally caused by a simple fall. His skull was never recovered. And through it all, the firearm he carried for protection remained fully loaded. 3 different men. 3 experienced outdoorsmen. 3 separate investigations. 3 official conclusions that sounded almost identical. Cause of death: unknown. Undetermined. Unexplained. The forests of Minnesota and Washington lie roughly 1,500 miles apart. They contain different wildlife, different climates, different landscapes. Yet these cases share striking similarities that continue to fuel debate among investigators, researchers, and countless people fascinated by wilderness mysteries. It's important to remember something. None of these investigations officially concluded that an unknown creature, a criminal act, or any supernatural force was responsible. The evidence simply wasn't sufficient to support those claims. Many possibilities have been discussed over the years. Undetected medical emergencies, environmental exposure, accidents in unforgiving terrain, predator activity after death, or factors investigators were never able to reconstruct. The truth is that no single explanation fully answers every question left behind. And that's exactly why these stories continue to haunt people. Not because we know what happened, but because we don't. Perhaps the wilderness is simply far more unpredictable than we'd like to believe. Perhaps tiny pieces of evidence disappeared long before search teams ever arrived. Or perhaps these forests still hold answers waiting to be uncovered. Until then, 3 families remain without complete closure. 3 investigations remain permanently unfinished. And somewhere beneath towering trees and endless silence, the wilderness is still keeping the rest of the story to itself. Because sometimes, the most terrifying mystery isn't what investigators discover. It's what they never find.